I'm enjoying the week here at the Kinsler Bartimaeus Institute, where we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Beyond Vietnam speech, which Dr. King delivered on April 4th, 1967 at the Riverside Church. I had the honor of sharing some of the personal history of Vincent Harding, Dr. Vincent Harding, who was the writer, the primary writer of the Beyond Vietnam speech, a man who was a friend, an advisor, a neighbor to Dr. King, and a really integral part of the movement, what he calls the Black-led movement for the deepening and broadening of democracy in this country. He would often refer to the civil rights movement, that term civil rights movement, as kind of a cop-out of lazy journalists. That really what was happening was this black-led movement to deepen democracy in our country. I had the privilege in 2011 of doing an extended interview with Dr. Harding, where he shared primarily about his formation within the Anabaptist tradition and as a Mennonite pastor in the 50s, but also shared some about his experience of being asked to draft the Beyond Vietnam speech, and then what happened following that in terms of both the assassination of Dr. King, but the ongoing movement that throughout his life until his early 80s when he passed away, he was very much a part of. As someone not as well known in our history of the civil rights movement as Dr. King and others, he consistently committed himself to be a student of history, to be a mentor and a teacher to others, to himself be mentored and taught by his elders, but also by people who were younger than him. He was someone who believed so much in intergenerational groups working together to transform our society. And so as a young person, getting to interact with him was such a gift. He was someone who challenged me to be empowered to tell my story, to work for change in my community. I remember one time when he was visiting where I was living at the time in northern Indiana, we were going to a speaking engagement where he would be speaking, and he asked me, Joanna, what would you like to talk about today? What do you think your community would want to talk about with me today? And I said something like, well, Dr. Harding, we're just so honored that you're here. Anything that you're feeling led to share, we would love to hear that. We're just so honored that you're here. And he looked at me and he said, Joanna, this is your community, and you need to tell me what your community needs to hear. And so, of course, this was said with a lot of love, but also like a lot of directness. And so I kind of like gulped and then had a response, because I did know what my community needed. I did know what we were working on. And that was one small example of the way he was always calling people to take responsibility, to know who they were and where they were, and to be working there, not looking to an outside authority to tell them what to do or how to work for justice. And so when we think about what was going on in the movement as the Beyond Vietnam speech was drafted, again, it was Harding doing his part as someone who had studied the conflict in Vietnam, someone who was at that point teaching American history. He was well equipped to draft the Beyond Vietnam speech because he was a student of what was happening in Vietnam, because he was a professor at that time at Spelman of American history and knew that in order to be a teacher in that historical moment, he needed to understand the history of what was happening in the conflict in Vietnam. He also had been a Mennonite pastor and understood the pastoral concerns that King was carrying as he was going to be publicly making this statement to the nation against the war, but not just against the war, but connecting the struggle in the United States for justice to the struggle across the world. So if you look at the speech, you can tell in some ways that it's written by a historian, because, you know, there's a big chunk of it in the middle that just lays out the history of the crisis in Vietnam. And you also see the pastor coming through, this calling people to their best selves, calling this country to embody something different than just being the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. So Dr. Harding, in writing that, although a very significant thing for him to do, like, this was just one part of his calling. It was something that he could offer to the movement. And he, in his experience, expected everyone else was doing the same thing, offering what they could, bringing their full selves. And we see throughout his life that he continued to do that as an educator, as a mentor, as a catalyst of movements, as a networker. He was constantly connecting people to each other, so that they could strengthen their understandings and their movements. And so I think the gift of, well, one of the many gifts of Dr. Harding is that we can see what a life well lived looks like, what a life committed to movement looks like, that he really embodied what he was writing about in Beyond Vietnam. Like, what does it mean to look beyond Vietnam? Not to negate Vietnam, but to say, how do we connect this to everything else? And so in the decades that followed in his life, he continued to embody this way of critiquing the American imperial system and to having this creative vision of the kind of community we could create together. And he was tireless in his work to continue to do that. But I wouldn't say he was someone who was endlessly working and burning himself out. He had this spiritual depth. He had this cadence of reflective thinking and speaking, and was someone who knew when to take rests and to slow down. So I think even in that, like, a tireless commitment to working for justice throughout one's life doesn't mean being constantly burnt out. So I think he offered us some wisdom along those lines. So it's been really wonderful to have the opportunity to share this story and to also hold it alongside all of the other input and stories that are being shared at the Institute this week, looking at the relevance of this most important speech for our work today, as well as saying who are the visionaries that continue to guide us, and what are the visions that we carry together as a community. And that's where I would invite anyone who hasn't experienced an institute to come and to check it out, because it's definitely a place of learning, but it's also a place of empowerment and of relationship building, of doing these things that Dr. Harding was committed to throughout his life, of being together, going into deeper relationship, and with that trust, with knowing that we're loved and held by a community, doing these creative and courageous things. So I think part of what this institute offers us is a sense of being in the struggle, being in the movement together with others, and taking risks that maybe we otherwise wouldn't have the strength to do.